People who move to the woods always talk about silence, peace, getting away from it all. I used to believe that too, until I moved into the Keller house. It was tucked into a forest that didn't show up on Google Maps, just a clearing surrounded by warped pine trees in northern Vermont. My name's Alan Rose. I'm 32, and I was fresh out of a divorce and in desperate need of both cheap property and solitude. The Keller place checked both boxes. The ad read, a fixer-upper cabin in the secluded High Hollow Pines region. Great for writers, nature lovers, and those seeking absolute quiet. 2BR, 1BA, fully furnished. Inquire fast. Land like this doesn't last. They weren't lying. I wish they were. The house was old, maybe late 1800s. Floorboards soft as sponges in some places, walls with so many layers of paint they had their own gravity. But that first night, I slept like a corpse. No highway, no city lights, just wind, until something woke me. It was around 3:30 a.m. A sound, a long, low groan. Not human, not mechanical, wood, but alive. Like an old floorboard, but deeper. It came from beneath the house, through the beams and nails. I sat up in bed, my ears straining, and then I heard it again. Groan, followed by the unmistakable sound of something whispering my name. Ealalan. I remember laughing nervously. You laughed to convince yourself the noise was the wind, that you were just dreaming. But my body knew better. My skin knew better. There was something ancient in that voice, something that knew the way my name felt when it was wet and broken and buried in soil. The next morning, I went out of the house. There was a crawl space, just enough room for me to belly crawl with a flashlight. I figured maybe an animal got in, a raccoon or a coyote. I didn't find animals. I found scratches, dozens of them, long lines etched deep into the floor beams, as if something had dragged claws back and forth. Not a little, hundreds of times. The same lines, the same direction, over and over like something trying to tunnel upward. And there was something else. A word scratched faintly in the wooden post closest to my bedroom. Al and I backed out fast. Maybe some local kid had snuck in. Maybe it was a prank. That was the last rational explanation I had. It wouldn't last. The previous owner, I'd learned, was a man named Martin Keller. Lived alone. No family. He disappeared back in 1992. Left the cabin as is. On my second week, I found his journal tucked inside the wall of the bedroom closet. It was wrapped in oilcloth. Pages warped and brittle. Most of it was gibberish long, scrawled paragraphs about what hunger, waking trees, and a phrase he repeated dozens of times. The wood remembers who walks above. In the margins, he scratched strange diagrams. Circles within trees. Stick figure men with no eyes. Arrows pointing down. On the last page, he wrote one line. Don't answer when it says your name. That night, I boarded up the closet. I started hearing it more frequently, always at night. The groaning, sometimes long and mournful, like the house was breathing. Sometimes short and sharp, like something shifting in the walls. It always began the same way, the name. My name, whispered in cracked, wooden syllables. It stopped being just the floor. It came from the trees now. When the wind blew just right, the pines would bend toward the house. I could swear I saw their trunks moving, warping like ribs, their bark curling like skin. And the sound, oh God, the sound, it came in rhythms. Like something speaking in a language made of knots and sap and decay. ###6. The visitors, I had 2 friends visit, just for a night. They didn't last until morning. When they arrived, they laughed at my paranoia, said it was just cabin fever. One of them, Jeremy, even went out to relieve himself in the woods around midnight. He didn't come back. We found him at dawn, lying in the grass, mouth full of pine needles, every tooth cracked in half, lips torn open like he'd been biting bark. The coroner said it looked like he fell and hit a rock, but his shoes were missing. And the last sound he ever heard? My other friend, Darren, swore he heard it too, Ayalalan. I couldn't take it anymore. I hired a contractor, an old guy named Wade, local to the area, to help reinforce the beams beneath the house. I didn't tell him why, just said I wanted it stabilized. He went under, didn't come back out. When I crawled under to check, I found his tool bag, still zipped, but something was wet on it, sticky. Further back, in the dirt, I found a hole, perfectly round, like something dug up from below. A faint scent of moss and rot wafted up, and in the soil, a single human tooth. That night, every wall in the house groaned, louder than before. Urgent, insistent. The closet door opened on its own. Inside was the journal, now open to a new page, one I hadn't written. Come down, Alan. That was the first night I dreamed in wood. I won't describe the dream. I don't want you to dream it too. By the time I realized it wasn't just dreams or paranoia, it was already too late to sell the house. You can't list a place when the floorboards bleed sap that smells like rot, or when you wake up at 2:45 a.m. with pine needles stuffed in your mouth. I hadn't left my room in 3 days. I'd dragged the mattress to the center of the floor and surrounded it with lanterns. I didn't trust the power anymore. It flickered even when the switch was off. Every night, I heard groaning under the bed. Not just wood bending, but movement, like something shifting slowly just beneath the floor. It paced, and it knew my name. That night, it whispered again. Eowalan, come down, come down. Not outside, not in the trees. This time, under the bed. I snapped. I ripped up the floorboards. Every plank in the bedroom. Beneath the wooden subfloor, there had always been crawl space, packed earth. But now there was something else. A hole, about the size of a manhole cover, lined with wet, black root systems that pulsed when I looked at them too long. The scent that came out of it was alive. Not just decay, breathing wood. I shined a flashlight down. No bottom. I tossed a pebble in. No sound. Then something looked back. A shape just for a second. Something not human, but built like it had studied humans too long. Wide shoulders, splintered arms, and no face, just a knotted, rotted cavity where the head should be. When I blinked, it was gone. I went into town to find someone who could help. That's when I met Eldon Mark, an old man who ran the town's antique salvage yard. When I mentioned the Keller house, he paled. You bought that place? He asked, half whispering. I told him what I'd heard. The groans, the dreams, the teeth in the crawl space. He didn't laugh. He didn't even look surprised. You've got a wood echo, he muttered. I didn't understand. He explained. Back in the 1880s, the house was built by a carpenter named Simon Hatch, a man obsessed with living wood. Said he could hear the forest talking. He'd go into the pines and come back with logs still dripping sap, claiming they told him which ones to cut. He built a house from those trees. He never left. One day, the town stopped seeing him. They say he dug beneath the house, looking for something he called the root womb. Claimed it was where the forest breathed new voices. They found his tools, blood, teeth, but not him. Eldon looked me dead in the eye before I left. The house doesn't want you to leave, son. And if it starts knowing your name, that means it's rooted you. I tried to leave. I packed everything, got in my truck, made it 3 miles down the dirt road. That's when I saw them. The trees. Dozens of them, all fallen across the road. Not broken, not wind damaged. Placed. Each trunk was carved. Not with names, but mouths. Hundreds of them. Open. Groaning. I walked to the nearest one. Leaned in. And from deep inside the wood, I heard my voice. Alan, why are you leaving? I screamed. I ran. The forest didn't follow. It just watched. When I got back, the house had changed. The windows were fogged. Inside smelled like wet bark. My family photos, all of them had warped. The glass in the frames had cracked. And behind the photos, something new. Inside the wood of each frame, there were lines carved from within. Like tiny figures had been scratching from the inside of the wood, trying to crawl out. Some of them had faces now. Not my family. Not human. Just empty eye sockets and gaping mouths that echoed the same phrase. Come down. On the 5th night, I gave up trying to sleep. I took an axe. I went into the crawl space. The hole was still there, wider now. Breathing almost. I dropped into it. Below the house wasn't just dirt. It was timber, but ancient, lined like a tunnel. A throat made of trees. As I walked deeper, the walls whispered. Faces formed in the knots my name was chanted in wood grain. At the end of the tunnel, I found a room. Square, made of pine, floor to ceiling. And in the center, a rocking chair. And someone was in it. But they weren't human anymore. Their body had merged with the wood, arms stretching into chair legs. Hair made of bark. Their mouth, open and dripping sap, moved without muscle. They whispered, "You were always meant to come back down, Alan." The man in the chair, if he could still be called that, was rotted into the wood. His rib cage creaked when he breathed, splinters jutting from his sides like insect legs. His skin had the texture of aged pine, warped and split. His mouth, agape and weeping amber-colored sap, tried to form words, but each attempt sounded like bark being slowly peeled back. "You're home." "Alan." I backed away. The tunnel behind me groaned. Not from pressure. From displeasure. Like the house knew I was trying to leave again. And then the voice came not from the man, not from the chair, but from the walls. "Don't run. You're in us now." I fled through the tunnel, clawing my way back to the crawl space, then up into my bedroom. But it was no longer my bedroom. The wood had grown. Knots in the floor had become eyes. Not human, more like the distorted faces of forgotten things, buried in wood and grief. Vines with tiny, gray buds had sprouted from the floorboards, and they followed me as I moved. The buds pulsed like hearts. When I looked down, my feet were stained black. Sap. And the worst part? The floorboards had shifted, rearranged, and the names of my family were carved into them, like the house had swallowed their memories. Even my mother's handwriting, etched into the grain. "Alan, come back inside." I never brought that note into this house. That night, the house made new sounds. There were whispers behind every wall. Not voices, but with groaning words. A long, pained wheeze that shaped syllables. Ale, Lennon, and something crawling too. I took a sledgehammer and smashed the wall by the kitchen pantry. Behind it, not studs, a narrow hallway, and a tiny handprint pressed into the wood. Not paint, not dirt, flesh embedded. There were teeth nailed in rows along the corners. Old teeth, tiny ones, like from a child. I called Eldon Mark again. This time, he didn't answer. So I went to his salvage yard. His place was empty. But I broke into his back office and found something he'd kept hidden, a journal bound in thin cedar bark, its pages damp with mildew and scrawled with frantic ink. He'd been tracking the Keller house for years. He believed it was part of a root system of memory, a phrase he repeated dozens of times. The trees remember pain, especially man-made pain. What holds memory better than flesh? What is carved into what lives there? One page was torn with a note. Once the house speaks your name, it has seeded your lungs. The next breath is not yours. When I got home, the mirror in the hallway was fogged. Not like steam, like a breath had been exhaled directly onto the glass. I wiped it. There was a new reflection. Not mine. It was me, but older, covered in bark, sap dripping from my eyes, and the mouth. The mouth was stitched shut with moss. Then the reflection blinked. I didn't. It leaned forward, and it whispered, "You left me down there. We're never whole until we're inside the wood." I started coughing that night. Violent, racking coughs that brought up thick black syrup. The same color as what had stained the trees. My fingernails had turned gray. I looked under them. Tiny splinters. Dozens of them, wriggling like parasites. My skin smelled like bark. My eyes had started to blur things that weren't wood. I could see the veins in the walls now. The pulsing grain, and I swear, when I passed the guest room, the crib I'd thrown away months ago was back and rocking. But nothing was in it. Not yet. In a final act of desperation, I drove out to the town's public records office. I found the blueprints. The house was never supposed to have a basement, but the plans from 1887 showed something else, an off-the-books edition made by Simon Hatch. A pit beneath the home labeled Memoriae. The blueprints had a note etched in the margin in Hatch's own hand, for the memories they couldn't bury above ground. Let the roots drink their names. And then I understood. The house was a grave, but not for bodies. For souls. For names. Groaning started again. Not outside. Not from the warped trees, nor the rotting floorboards, nor the foundation. Not even from the forest. It came from inside the walls. It was 3:12 a.m. when I first heard it, an unnatural, warbled groan so deep it vibrated the drywall. Not like pipes, not like wind. It had resonance. Intention, like the house itself was exhaling through wooden lungs and saying my name. Whispers had come before, tiny frictions in the corners of the house when I stood still too long. Shifting sounds behind light switches. Subtle patterns in the creaking floor. But this was different. It sounded like it was coming from just beyond the plaster. I bolted upright in bed, heart pounding. And then the scratching began. Soft at first, then more deliberate. Like a single long fingernail tracing the inside of the wall right behind the headboard. I didn't scream. I froze. I listened. The noise traveled along the wall behind me, then made a slow turn, like something was pacing. I leaned toward the corner of the room, where the wall met the built-in wardrobe, and then I heard it again. That wordless groan, like a long, dragging breath through splinters and phlegm. I whispered, "Hello." A pause. Then 3 knocks. Right behind the wall. Knock, knock, knock. I didn't sleep again that night. The next morning, I tried to find rational explanations. Old houses creak. Insulation settles. Rodents live in walls. But I knew this wasn't anything alive. It was too rhythmic, too aware. I pressed my ear against the spot behind the bed. Nothing. I tapped. Nothing. I even knocked 3 times. And then waited. Nothing responded. But something had changed. There was a faint odor I hadn't noticed before. The sour, sweet smell of rot. Like a corpse was decaying in the walls. I pulled the wardrobe aside, cleared the furniture, and placed my palms flat against the plaster. It was warm, only in that one area. Later that day, I called in a contractor, an old guy named Paul who worked independently and knew the area. I didn't tell him what I thought I heard, just that there might be a dead animal trapped behind the walls. He brought tools, a flashlight, a crowbar, and a weird look when he stepped into my bedroom. "You smell that?" he asked. I nodded. Rotten wood, but sweet. Not mildew, not sewer gas either. He tapped along the wall. "Here," he said, pointing to the warmest patch. Doesn't sound right. It sounded hollow, more than it should, like an empty cavity inside the drywall that didn't belong. Paul marked the spot and gently cut a square out of the wall. I stood behind him as he worked, trying not to imagine what might crawl out. When he finally pulled the drywall off, there was nothing. No studs, no wires, no insulation, just darkness. A void. And the walls weren't just empty, they were smooth. Like clay or stone, not lumber. No framework, no structure. "Jesus Christ," Paul whispered. "What the hell am I looking at?" He reached in with his flashlight. His hand didn't come back. "Paul." He was frozen. His whole arm was inside the hollow. Then 2 feet. Then half his torso. I lunged and pulled. He screamed. His body came back, but his arm, from the elbow down, was gone. Just gone, like it had been bitten off by empty air. He was babbling, bleeding, sobbing. I wrapped his stump in my bedsheet and called 911. He kept muttering the same phrase over and over again. There were faces. In the dark. Paul didn't survive the night. Shock and blood loss, the hospital said. But that wasn't the worst part. That night, I had a visitor. Sarah, or what looked like Sarah. She disappeared when we were kids. One of the many taken by the woods. The official story was that she fell into the ravine while playing hide and seek. They never found her body. I still remembered the last time I saw her. She'd begged me to follow her into the trees, saying she'd found a place where the wood talks back. She stood in my bedroom doorway now. Pale, soaked, rotting. Her skin was slick and sunken like she'd been underwater for years. Her eyes were pure white. Her mouth hung open like it didn't know how to close anymore. And she was smiling. I couldn't move, couldn't scream. She walked over to the hole in the wall, the one Paul had opened, and pressed her decayed hand against the edge. The wall groaned, not from pain, from excitement. Sarah looked at me, tilted her head, and spoke. Not with her mouth, but through the walls. "It wants you to listen now," she said. "You were always supposed to come back." And then she stepped inside the hollow and vanished. The next day, every photo in the house changed. My mother's smile was replaced with a scream. My father's eyes were gone. In one old photo of me as a child, my mouth had been erased, replaced with a black scribble like it had been scratched out. When I flipped over one of the frames, someone had written in black ink, "The groaning started with you." I tried to leave. I packed what I could, ran to the front door, and found it missing. The door was gone. The frame replaced with smooth, unbroken wallboard. Every window now showed different scenery. Not the yard, not the driveway. Just endless forest, black, wet trees and fog. And something tall, thin, bent was moving between them. That night, the walls began whispering again. Not words. Names. My name. Over and over and over. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard the floor breathing beneath me. Not creaking breathing. A slow, moist inhale. A rough exhale. Like something with lungs beneath the house. And it wasn't alone anymore. They were everywhere. The walls whispered. The ceiling croaked. Even the furniture seemed to vibrate with faint murmurs like distant voices pressed against rotting fabric. And the hole Paul had cut in the bedroom wall, it was wider now. When I stepped inside, the drywall was soft. It gave under my hands like pulp meat. I pushed forward into the cavity behind my room and saw that it wasn't just a hollow, it was a passage. It wound behind the walls like a tunnel, narrow and slick, the size of a child's crawl space. And the walls moved, slowly, like lungs, like they were filled with breath. I didn't go deeper. Not yet. The next morning, if it was morning, I found an old leather-bound notebook on the kitchen table. I hadn't put it there. It looked ancient, warped by moisture, bound with sinew instead of thread. I recognized the handwriting. It was my grandfather's. I'd never seen this book before. I opened to the first page. The wood remembers. That was all it said. The rest of the journal was filled with entries dating back to 1934, when my grandfather first purchased the land. He wrote of hearing strange sounds under the foundation, of dreams he couldn't wake from, of doors closing and opening on their own, of whispers calling his name from the floorboards, of Sarah's family, his neighbors, who vanished entirely in the spring of 1936. The final pages weren't words. They were drawings, faces, pressed behind walls, reaching through floorboards, screaming silently. And on the last page, a child standing alone, surrounded by figures crawling out of the house itself, faceless, with limbs like branches and mouths full of teeth embedded in wood. Below the image, the house was never built. It was grown. I don't know what compelled me to do it. Maybe I thought I could still fight back. Maybe I was desperate. But I grabbed a crowbar from the shed and began prying up the floor in the living room. The groaning returned instantly. Not like wood, like pain. A low howl deep beneath my feet. I kept going. The floorboards were darker underneath, soft, damp. And when I pulled up the third plank, I saw something that didn't make sense. A tooth. Not human. Not animal. Something wrong in its proportions. Too flat, too long. Yellowed and jagged. Embedded into the timber like it had grown there. I pulled another board. More teeth. And then a tongue. Pink. Gray-veined. Wet. Moving. The floor was a mouth. When I dropped the crowbar, it vanished. Slurped up between the planks like the house swallowed it. I fell backward. Every wall moaned at once. The ceiling cracked. A whisper escaped the pipes. Come closer. Let me remember your bones. I had to know. If this place wanted me, if it grew for me, I had to see what was underneath. I crawled into the basement, the one door that hadn't disappeared. The air was thick with mildew and something worse. The coppery smell of blood, stale and sticky. Cobwebs clung to my face. The concrete was cracked, and in the far back corner, behind a pile of crumbled bricks, was an opening I'd never noticed. Not a door, a hole, just big enough for a body. I slipped through. The tunnel sloped down. It was made of earth at first, but then it became organic. The walls grew damp and dark. Roots protruded like veins. And in the distance, something pulsed, a rhythm like a heart beating inside the soil. Then I saw them, the others. They were suspended in the walls, half absorbed, barely human. Faces twisted in agony, skin fused to wood, bones interlaced with vines. One of them looked like Paul, another like my grandmother. One of them was me, or a version of me, younger, smaller, with empty eyes and a twisted smile. Its hand twitched. It opened its mouth, and the house spoke through it. You were born of my breath. You belong to me. At the tunnel's end was something ancient. A room not built but grown. Its walls were bark. Its ceiling rippled like muscle. And at its center was a giant wooden heart, veined with vines, pulsing with wet, sap-like blood. Carved into the walls were names. Hundreds, maybe thousands. I found mine. It was still wet. As I stared, I heard something behind me. A creaking footstep, then another. I turned and saw dozens of figures slithering into the chamber, limbs made of branches, eyes hollow, mouths stuffed with teeth made of wood. They weren't walking. They were growing. The walls birthed them as I watched. They whispered as one, "Let us back in." There are no more days and nights inside the house. No clocks, no sleep, no time. The light never changes. The shadows do. I've stopped leaving the house because it won't let me. Every time I try the front door, it leads back into the kitchen. Every time I break a window, there's nothing outside but darkness, a thick, pulsing dark that breathes and hums like a throat before a scream. I once threw a chair into it, and it vanished with a sucking pop, like I'd dropped it into an endless pit of wet lungs. I think the house has folded in on itself, like it's digesting me. The floorboards bulge now. Sometimes I see hands pressing up through them, small ones, baby-sized, nails clicking softly like insects. Once I knelt and placed my ear to the floor. It whispered my name, but it wasn't just my name. It was my father's and his mother's and my grandfather's. One after another, backward through time, until it hissed a name I didn't recognize, something ancient, gurgling, and full of consonants like cracked bone. Then the floor laughed. There was a room in the attic I'd never entered. It was locked when I was a child, and later, no matter how hard I tried, the keyhole would vanish or the door would move. But last night, I heard it open on its own. I climbed the attic stairs. The door was waiting, just wide enough to beckon. Inside was the nursery. Not a nursery. The nursery. The one from the photos. The one from my grandfather's journal. The room for the child who never lived. The crib sat in the center, carved from gnarled wood, blackened with sap. Inside lay a bundle of blankets that moved. Something inside it breathed. The walls were papered with family photos, but all of them had moss growing over the faces. Not just moss, hair, and teeth. When I looked closer, the moss pulsed. It would groan around me, and on the far wall was a mirror. But it didn't reflect me. It showed a version of me, older, with skin like bark and eyes dripping black sap. My reflection opened its mouth and spoke from behind me. You never left. You've always been inside me. You were grown here like the rest. I don't know what I am anymore. I dug through the basement again. This time the tunnel welcomed me. It opened for me. I crawled through the wet roots and reached the wooden chamber. The heart at its center beat louder than ever, like a war drum made of wet trunks and tendon. The names on the wall had multiplied. All the names of my family. All the names of those who vanished. And beside them, new names etched in glistening lines. My children who never existed. My name, over and over, with a new number each time. I screamed. I picked up a shard of jagged wood and slashed my arm. The blood ran black. Sap. And I understood. I was never just living in a house. I'm the house. She came again. Sarah, but not Sarah. Her skin hung loose, her hair soaked with rainwater, her mouth full of moss and baby teeth. Her eyes were pits of roots. She smiled, wider than bone allows, and stepped forward on legs that bent the wrong way. You remember now, don't you? She said. We were planted here. Seeds, each of us. The land doesn't forget what it buries. I asked her what the house wanted. She knelt, touched the floor with one bloated hand, and whispered, "It wants to grow again." Then she peeled her face off like wet bark, revealing nothing but an open knot of writhing mouths beneath. And the walls joined in. The groaning wasn't wood anymore. It was laughter. I soaked the house in gasoline, walls, floorboards, ceilings. But the fire never caught. It hissed. It rejected the flame. I poured lighter fluid down the walls into the breathing tunnel, across the nursery where the bundle still throbbed in the crib. Nothing. Not smoke. Not ash. The flame bent away from the wood, like it feared it. And then the house whispered, "You cannot burn your own skin." I collapsed. I wept. I screamed until my throat bled sap. And then I understood what it wanted me to do. I crawled back to the tunnel and found the heart again. But now it had grown. It took up the whole chamber, veined with the names of everyone it had ever consumed. Pulsing. Alive. There was one open spot left. A hollow knot in the grain, shaped like a body. Mine. I stepped forward. The vines reached out, slow and gentle. As they pulled me in, I heard the voice again, not from the walls, but inside my skull. Now you remember. Now you are home. The heart opened. It was warm. It beat with my pulse. It tasted me. And then I was gone. If you find this story, burn the pages. But it won't work. The house doesn't live on wood alone. It grows in memory. It grows in names. It only needed me to remember. Now it needs you to forget. So I'll ask one final thing before the moss takes my voice. Do not go to the house with groaning floors. Do not listen when it calls your name, because the name it calls might not be yours anymore. It might be the one it gave you. Long ago, when you were first planted,